Do you ever notice how some words from history seem really simple on the surface, but when you dig in, they unlock this entire hidden world? Well, today we're diving into one of those words, concubine. It's a term that for thousands of years wasn't some shameful secret, but a real profound social reality. So let's find out what it really meant.
So when you hear that word, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Is it just an old-timey word for a mistress, someone kept hidden away? Well, the actual history is so much more complex and, frankly, a lot more interesting than that. The real question is, what was it really? Because we're not talking about some fringe idea here. This was a recognized status that shows up in ancient legal codes, in major religious texts, and in the very structure of powerful empires. It was a fundamental piece of how society was put together for a huge portion of human history.
To really get this, we've got to start at the beginning. The Hebrew Bible, what many call the Old Testament. In the original Hebrew, the term for a concubine is pilagish, and it basically functioned like a kind of secondary marriage.
Okay, so let's break this down. A wife, she typically brought a dowry, money or property, which gave her full legal standing. A pilesh didn't. But here's the absolute key, right at the bottom. Both were legally protected and exclusive relationships. This was not some casual fling. This was a recognized, binding part of the family structure.
But of course, these weren't just legal definitions. These were real people. And one of the most powerful stories we have is that of Hagar. She was an Egyptian servant to Sarah, Abraham's wife, and she became Abraham's pilagish to give him an heir. Her life was incredibly tough, caught right in the middle of some serious family drama. After she flees into the desert, the story says that God speaks directly to her. And in that moment, Hagar gives God a name, El Roi, which means the God who sees me. And get this, she is the only person in the entire Bible to give God a name. It's this profound statement that no matter her secondary social status, in the eyes of the divine, she was seen, she was valued. Now, as we move forward in history, this institution also became a massive display of power. I mean, King Solomon is said to have had 700 wives and 300 concubines. For a king, this wasn't just about his personal life. It was a huge political and economic statement. It showed the world that he had the immense wealth and influence needed to support and protect 1,000 different families.
Okay, so now let's jump ahead to the Roman Empire and see how this idea evolved. The Romans were famous for being practical, and their approach to relationships was exactly that. They actually created a legal status that might really surprise you. They called it concubinatus. And let's be clear, this was not a system for cheating on your wife, not at all. It was an honest, public, recognized partnership for couples who, by law, literally could not get married. For instance, a high-ranking senator was legally forbidden from marrying a woman who had once been a slave. So if they wanted to build a life together, they entered a concubinatus, a stable, long-term, legally acknowledged relationship.
Now, you'd probably expect the early church to have condemned this, right? Well, you'd be wrong. As late as 400 AD, the Council of Toledo ruled that a man in a faithful relationship with a concubine should not be denied communion. This tells us that at the time, the church cared more about fidelity and commitment to one person than about what a couple's official legal title was.
But then, the great shift happened. For centuries, this was an understood, even legal part of society. But as we move into the Middle Ages, the church started insisting that every single union had to be a formal sacrament. The once legal status of a concubine got completely redefined, and the relationship was recast as living in sin. This is the moment, the historical turning point that creates the negative stigma so many of us have today.
But the story doesn't end there. In a really fascinating twist, these ancient ideas get reinvented in 19th century America by two very, very different groups who are both looking back to history for a little bit of inspiration. First up, the early Latter-day Saints, or Mormons. Joseph Smith taught what he called a restoration of all things, believing that practices from the Old Testament should be brought back. So this passage from their scripture, the Doctrine and Covenants, directly references the wives and concubines of figures like David, presenting it as a divinely sanctioned practice. And that became the theological basis for their own practice of plural marriage.
Okay, so at the same time, a completely different view of history was popping up through the rediscovery of Gnostic texts. In books like the Gospel of Philip, the whole focus shifts from legal status to spiritual partnership. This passage about Mary Magdalene uses the Greek word koionos, which means companion or partner, raising her role to something far beyond just a follower.
So you see, for the Gnostics, a partner wasn't a wife or a concubine in any legal sense. She was a companion in wisdom, a spiritual equal. They believed the ultimate goal was to find your spiritual counterpart to become whole. The physical or social label, it was almost irrelevant compared to that shared spiritual bond.
All of this history, from ancient Israel to Rome, all the way to the American frontier, it kind of forces us to step back and ask a much bigger, much more fundamental question that goes way beyond any single label.
Does a title, one that's given to you by law or by society, actually determine your value as a human being? I mean, does being called a wife versus a concubine, or a CEO versus an intern, really define your intrinsic worth?
Well, if you look at the evidence, history's answer is a pretty clear and resounding no. God saw Hagar when society ranked her as secondary. The New Testament preached a message of radical equality, erasing social ranks like bond or free. And even secular philosophers like the Stoics were arguing that your true value comes from your character, not your station in life.
Ultimately, the history of the concubine isn't just a collection of dusty old laws. It's a story about human dignity. It really serves as this powerful reminder of the millions of women who navigated their world, built lives, and found meaning in all those complicated spaces that existed right between society's official rules.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. History shows us how these labels change, how they're created, and how they fade away. So the real question for us today is this: what labels are we still living with, and what kind of spaces are we creating between them?